Hello, and welcome to today's podcast. We're very excited to be joined by several members of our Cleanroom team from both North America and Europe, and we'll hear a quick introduction from them in just a moment. But today, we're talking about safety and regulations. Everyone wants a safe product. Regulations are out there to make this happen, but why are the regulations so different? So we're joined today by several members of Contec's Cleanroom team. Could we go around the screen here and just do a quick introduction? We'll start with Dave.
Yeah, my name's Dave Nobile. I'm the Technical Services Group Manager for Contec.
And I'm Amy Russ. I'm the Global Product Manager for Contec's Cleanroom business. I've worked for Contec for about 10 and a half years now.
I'm Neil Simpson. I'm the Technical and R&D Manager for Contec in Europe, and I've been with Contec for 10 years.
And I'm Karen Rossington. I'm the European Marketing Manager for the Cleanroom division in Europe, and I've been with Contec 10 years as well.
Wow, I feel like
and I'm Daniel Crow. I'm Contec's Manager in Multimedia, and I've been here for about 5 or 6 years, so I'm the baby of the group. So thanks, guys. Everyone on this podcast plays a different but integral role in providing education and product development for our Cleanroom customers. Although the roles are different, one thing remains the same: assisting our facilities in their contamination control efforts through innovative product development and training so our customers can provide safe products to consumers. That being said, there are different regulatory bodies and rules facilities must follow depending on the country they're located in. And on this podcast today, we have people from all over the world, literally. So I'm just going to throw this first question out to the group. Do you guys see a difference in the regulations facilities need to follow, and why is that?
Well, that's a great question. Difference in the regulations that facilities need to follow. Certainly there are regional differences, there are country differences in terms of the regulations. And I know Neil and Karen can speak to that quite a bit on the European side and the continent side. From the US perspective, right, the FDA has strict regulations regarding vaccine production, safety and whatnot. But interestingly enough, and I think this is where a lot of the confusion for our customers comes in, is the regulations say this is what you have to do, but they don't say how to do it. And while the regulations vary a little bit from country to country or region to region around the world, that kind of lack of clarity or lack of specificity is pretty much true everywhere.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that, Dave. It's the same with Europe. When we look at GMP, GMP gives guidelines for manufacturing of medicinal products, but the terminology, just like you said, it isn't that very specific terminology. It does not say you must or you have to. It gives scope for reading in several different ways.
In a lot of ways, it would be detrimental if it was too prescriptive. So
Yeah, I agree.
It has to allow for innovation. It has to allow for application to different types of medicines that are being manufactured.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing that a lot of people don't realize, right? They think, oh, we do this thing this way here, right? Not realizing that regulation applies to so many different processes, right? I mean, anywhere from old school tabulating drug manufacture all the way up to the latest mRNA injectable vaccines, right? And these processes are so substantially different, and the requirements for their environments and the requirements for specific areas of concern and risk are so different. So it's almost impossible, really, to have something that is so specifically prescriptive on how to accomplish something. And I think a lot of people miss that when they think about the regulations.
Well, I think Annex 1 in the new draft are trying to capture that sentiment. So even though they've expanded it hugely from what it is currently to what it's going to be, it starts with that it's got to be a holistic approach. It's got to be quality risk management. It's got to be for your process in your facility. So
yeah,
that's defining that now.
That's right, Karen. And at times they even say that quality risk management can potentially override some of the requirements that they're talking about if that is more suited to your facility.
Well, I'm going to play devil's advocate here for a minute, because I first of all, I totally agree with the holistic approach that Annex 1 promotes, right? In terms of contamination control and risk management. In the 30 plus years I've been doing this, I've always told customers, they're concerned with this one part of their process. And I've always taken the approach of, okay, but that one part of your process is affected by these 5 other things that happen before that, So that holistic, all-encompassing approach, I think, is really, really critical and very, very worthwhile, and ultimately would lead to more robust and perhaps more understandable and sensible contamination control practices and procedures. But, right, as you say, Karen, it is such a massive expansion of Annex 1, and this whole, we have, let's call them for the time being, small regulations right now that people are massively confused by because they lack specificity. And we're expanding that even more with less specificity. So while I totally agree with the approach and the philosophy behind it, saying, hey, you have to take this holistic approach and look at all these things and determine the risk to your product and do all that. That's so much more, so many more unknowns that people are either unfamiliar with or inexperienced with or unaccustomed to. And I think the confusion is going to be pretty rampant, frankly. I really do.
They're saying that you have to be specific. You have to define it all. They're going to put it under this, the Contamination Control Strategy document you need to have in your facility. You cannot not be specific, but they're not going to tell you. The European approach has never been to tell you.
But the FDA regulations, the USP has been the same way. It hasn't been to tell you necessarily, right? And it's led to that amount of questions that we get now, right? And I mean, granted, everyone historically, even with the regulations we have in place now, everyone has had to be specific in their SOPs, specific in their justification, specific in their validations for their facility. That hasn't changed. But now we're saying, okay, in Annex 1, we're saying, okay, you have to pay attention to all this additional stuff. And by the way, put it all together in a contamination control strategy.
When you hear the regulators speak about it, what they will tell you is all that's happened is they've written up what should have been happening in practice anyway. There is actually no change or very little change. It is purely putting into writing what their expectation has been for the last 10 years, certainly.
And that's a good point,
in
Karen.
a way,
I think what they'll say is, is that a lot of what they're asking, you should already be doing. You shouldn't even be waiting for Annex 1 to be published officially. That the expectation is for a GMP facility to be looking at these kind of modern, holistic or risk management strategies, however you want to put them. They should already be implementing most of what they're recommending.
I just wanted to come back and touch on a point that Neil made about the quality risk management almost superseding, some of the other pieces of the regulation. I mean, is it fair to say that the new draft of Annex 1 is almost hierarchical in a sense, like it creates a more structured framework for users to follow? I mean, is that fair?
To a degree, I think yes, because where Dave was saying there's a lot more information, but I think that information that has come in has actually explained certain areas in more detail than it had previously. And the problem is getting that correct blend of information that you can take and use compared to not enough information that you can then start almost having to guess what we need to be doing, compared to having too much information and doing something explicitly as they say. So I think they've expanded on certain elements with more detail, but enough detail for you to then start to put into practice where you think is right on your site, taking into consideration that quality risk management approach, which is a real, huge factor for any facility to be approaching for Annex 1 or even any regulations anywhere else in the world.
It's giving them, it suggests 14 like section headers for the contamination control strategy. Right. And it's saying that as a minimum, there's 14 subject areas that they should cover. So I suppose from that respect, it gives you a fairly clear idea of where to start.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I mean, Karen, clearly they have documented what people should have been doing all along, or at least that was I think they've documented what the intention of previous regulations was, right? And they've organized it in such a way that people see the interrelation of all of these different components, right? In a pharmaceutical or other drug manufacturing operation. And I still think the questions of how are we supposed to do this? What are the specifics of how we're supposed to do this are going to expand considerably.
Well,
even from what they are today.
You and Amy visit a huge number of different facilities, don't you? In all different, well, not only states, but across the world. So how much variation do you think you see then, bearing in mind that everyone is supposed to be working to this same
good question
regulation?
Yeah. See, and that's where the rubber meets the road, right? The regulations are not that different from place to place. I mean, people look at, say, for example, something coming out of Asia, and they think, oh, I wouldn't trust something coming out of Asia. But in fact, the regulations are based on, right, Udrelex and FDA regulations. I mean, they didn't create their own necessarily. They copied a lot.
Well, the reality, too, is if they're making a product that's being exported to the United States, it must comply with FDA guidelines.
No, exactly. But even those that don't, right? The regulations aren't that different worldwide. What is different is the degree to which people follow the regulations, or the degree to which they really put good faith into making into doing what they need to do to make a safe drug.
Again, Dave, is kind of that how they read that regulation compared to what they're currently doing. And again, let's take a perfect example. It's something that's certainly a topic with the update to Annex 1, and that's rotation. For many years, people have kind of discussed in lots of different ways what rotation means to them. Is it, 2 broad spectrum disinfectants, 2 sporicides, 1 broad spectrum, 2 sporicides, et cetera. And again, I think even with the more prescriptive information we have in the update to Annex 1, that's still open to interpretation at this moment in time.
And then you have the variable of those that can afford to follow the regulations properly and to the letter, and those that can't. And there, I think, is where the biggest disparity is. It's not so much in the desire to follow the regulations. It's not so much in any variation in the regulations. It's the variations in the ability or the wherewithal, right, to follow.
But should that matter if the starting point of the regulation is to provide a safe drug to a patient, and they have this certainly in the UK because of historical events, it does not matter if you are making 1 dose for 1 person or if you're making 1 million doses, you will consider the same things, because that patient doesn't care if you're making 1 or if you're making 1 million. So if you don't have the wherewithal and you can't afford to, you can't make product.
You shouldn't be making product.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the, what Dave was saying, the cans and the cannot follow the regulations. Like, what is I know this is going to sound like a baseline question, but what's the driving motivation to enforce these regulations from the regulatory point of view? And then from also the facilities, what makes them have to follow these regulations?
Patient safety. I mean, for both, that's going to be the driving motivator for the regulator as well as the pharmaceutical company.
Yep.
And the regulations are there to ensure that patient safety is achieved. Just happens to be, done in different ways in different regions, like we've been talking about.
Either patient health and safety or public health and safety, just depending, right? But again,
because if they get it wrong, they do kill people. That happens.
If they get it wrong, they do kill people. That does happen.
And I think what we also see is, on whether it be the US or Europe, is that when we've had some of these major incidents, it's been those incidents that have driven further regulatory progress, changes to regulations that have made that ultimate aim of patient safety even better. And it's a terrible condition to have had loss of life to be able to make things safer. But sometimes we can only learn from mistakes that have happened.
Okay. Sometimes it takes a crisis to change.
Yeah.
Well, usually it takes a crisis to change.
Especially in an industry where it's so costly to make a change.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah, and that has to be taken into consideration hugely.
Okay. So then maybe the question isn't so much, are the regulations different in various areas of the world? Because essentially they're not. Is the oversight different in different parts of the world, or the compliance different in different parts of the world? And clearly that is the case. So how do you address that? Right? How do you get someone in Bangladesh or wherever, right, to put forth the effort and the cost, right, to make a safe drug where it's perhaps not something they can afford to do?
Well, I suppose, certainly, again, only talking from what we see our side, is they are routinely audited. And as we've seen more of the certainly large European pharma move out into other countries where labor is cheaper, there's still a huge amount of auditory focus from the European regulators. And all of the European countries, and I believe even more now, are signed up to PICS, a pharmaceutical inspectors cooperation scheme, which lays out guidelines for all inspectors auditing to the same sort of level, so that they're trying to even that playing field all of the time. But if there's something that says, like, the FDA auditors who would go in,
but are those
happen?
But like Amy pointed out, right? Are those for drugs that are imported to the European Union, or are those for drugs that are used domestically in a particular given country? There's the rub.
Mainly
for anything imported,
it'll be for export, obviously.
Yeah.
Right. Anything imported to the EU, anything imported to the US, it has to undergo European or FDA oversight. Right. And FDA auditors go to these facilities in other countries and audit them and confirm that they're doing everything that they should be doing for the drug safety of those drugs that are shipped to the US. But what about domestic use? Right. It's hard. It's hard. It's expensive to manufacture drugs properly and safety.
So how in your experience, particularly Dave and Amy, traveling around to facilities, how do people know these regulations? Like how can they strive to follow these regulations and make the changes that help them fall into line with the regulations?
There are, positions at a lot of these companies that's their sole purpose is, their compliance officers or, quality professionals who their sole purpose at that facility is based in, enforcing practices that maintain compliance.
Yeah, and we were on we did a panel discussion a while back, and one of the panelists who was involved with the FDA, I think it was Peter Pitts, right? Professor Peter Pitts said, it's not true that there was political influence over a lot of the decisions that were made in vaccine production for COVID. And he stressed that, the people that are working in the CDC, the people that are working in the FDA are committed to the best science, committed to the best drug safety, right? The highest level of drug safety. And I think that's true of most responsible manufacturers as well, right? I mean, aside from the obvious desire not to kill people with your products, there's the PR issue, there's the there's the liability, financial liability issues. But I think by and large, people are in pharmaceutical manufacturing because they do want to do a world of good, and they want to do a world of good for the world at large. So yeah, I mean, there are people that are very, very committed. Everyone wants to do a good job. Everyone wants to do the best they can. Everyone wants to follow the regulations. Unfortunately, sometimes they don't know exactly what the regulations want or how to implement that, which is where we come in. But yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that at the end of the day, I think everyone's trying the best they can.
I mean, in the way it works in Europe is that you get a manufacturing authorization, an MA, for your product. And so not for your facility, not for a particular line, but for every product that you put on the market, you have to have what's called a marketing authorization. And as part of that marketing authorization, you have to manufacture to good manufacturing practice, which is where your facility and your personnel and your distribution, etc., come in. And you are going to be audited to that on a routine basis. And this is then, the regulations that we're talking about come in, the things that you will have to abide by, albeit in a non-specifically mentioned manner. And you will continually you'll be continually carrying out internal audits. But because, like with any regulation, you do get inference. This is why you will see huge numbers of conferences, huge numbers of webinars, and discussions that go on about the best way to meet part of these requirements. But the bit that I still find very interesting is we know that the regulations themselves are all trying to achieve the same thing of a safe product. They are large multinationals in both Europe and in the US. All these companies are audited, but our regulations are still quite different, aren't they? From one side, from the America to Europe. And I wonder if we're ever going to get closer in bridging some of those, like some quite fundamental differences, aren't there, in the way that we achieve the same thing of a safe product?
I don't know. Name 14 of them.
Well, so interestingly, I did a little bit of research before this meeting, and I had read an article about an FDA conference that was held in early 2020, and at this conference there were representatives from the FDA, the MHRA, the Russian State Institute of Drugs and Good Practices, and what was interesting is that so each of those agencies presented their top 10 findings from pharma companies in 2019.
Oh, that'd be interesting.
There was a lot of overlap.
Yeah.
So much overlap.
Which I expect there to be,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So, and I'll just list off some of the top common themes were data integrity, investigations of discrepancies, laboratory controls, finished product testing, stability programs, and then of course the big one that relates to Contec, equipment cleaning and maintenance.
Yep. And that list right there, right? Because it addresses data integrity, right? What are some of the others, Amy? Data integrity.
Data integrity, investigations of discrepancies.
Right.
Big one. Laboratory controls, finished product testing, stability programs, and equipment cleaning.
And that covers pharmaceutical manufacturing almost from soup to nuts, right? And that is where Annex 1 is bringing it all together in this whole holistic, right, contamination control strategy approach, where you say all of these things are related. And that's exactly why, because worldwide we have such commonality of issues. But I will tell you that the specific regulations can vary a little bit. The end goal of cleaning a facility properly, disinfecting a facility properly, maintaining sterility of an environment for injectables, for example, product testing and the data integrity, that is common throughout the world, right? Of responsible kind of top tier manufacturers. But we see so much variation in how that's executed, right? And there's the rub, because how it's executed is not stipulated by any of the regulations, right? How you actually achieve these things is not stipulated. And you see such a variety in interpretations of how to do these things. And some of them are interpreted really well and employ the best practices, and some of them are just not, you know?
And to what you said, that's sorry, go ahead, Neil.
I was going to say, I think some of those differences will start shrinking because, again, taking Annex 1 into perspective, they used regulatory authorities all over the world and they were looking to make the changes. So it wasn't just Europe involved with looking at Europe regulations. They involved the FDA, they involved Japan, they involved Australia, et cetera, et cetera. So now we are starting to get a more harmonized global view of regulations rather than region by region or zone by zone.
So I'm going to ask the obvious question with Annex 1. If it is such a big improvement, what is taking so long?
So many, right? Cooks in the kitchen.
Yeah.
And
there's definitely an element to that. And
to Neil's point, right? It's the first time they brought together all these regulatory agencies, and each of those organizations that had input to it also has a constituency that they have to go back with the draft and say, what do you think of what we've done? And that's how many responses did the first draft get? I mean, it was literally in the thousands and thousands of 6,000 comments back, right? And having to, and by stipulation, right? I mean, there are protocols and established rules for reviewing the feedback, right? So every one of those comments has to be read, evaluated, and addressed. Even if it's just, oh no, this isn't an issue and this is why, it still has to be addressed, every single one of them. So it's not a trivial undertaking. It's not like you can say, oh, 6,000, well, okay, fine. But most of those were regarding this and we're not worried about that. You can't do that.
Although this might backfire, because the first time they did go out for general comment, which I don't think always happens, and I'm not sure will happen ever again. Getting 6,000 comments.
So let's take a step back for just a second, because we never set up at the beginning of our talk who Contec is and what our role in this is. So Dave, could you take just 15 seconds to explain to people? I know that's really short, but take just a couple of seconds to explain to people just what we do in these areas that we're talking about.
Sure. So Contec is a manufacturer of essentially janitorial products that are used in cleaning and maintaining the contamination control, microbial control, and sterility of pharmaceutical and other types of clean rooms where sensitive critical manufacturing is performed worldwide.
And then in addition to the manufacturing of these products, we also do on-site assessments. Can you talk a little bit about that as well?
Sure. So especially, and that's near and dear to mine and Neil's hearts, because we have a group of people, subject matter experts that have many years of experience in contamination control and looking at different production processes throughout the world, whereby we go into a facility and we and these days we can do it virtually, but historically we've done it live. But now we've developed that tool where either live or virtually we'll go into a facility, we'll tour the facility with some knowledgeable people from that within that facility, and we'll take a look at their contamination control procedures, their SOPs, how they're actually following their SOPs, their practices, especially as it relates to cleaning and disinfection. But also as we've grown, we touch on many other areas of contamination control. And we make recommendations. We provide advice, we make recommendations, suggestions for improvement, recommendations on how they can achieve maybe not best practices, but better practices based on the realities of their specific facility. And I think that's important, right?
Making it tailored to their facility specifically is, Steve. Yeah.
Improving where you can is, I think, the key. And we do that worldwide. We provide a multiple page report with the findings, and we do that worldwide at no cost to the end user, which I think is crazy.
All right, so that's all for our commercial break. Let's dive back into the talk here. As we have people on this who are experts in the FDA regulation, upcoming Annex 1, let's talk about what are some of the changes coming forth with Annex 1 and some of the other regulatory bodies. So anyone want to dive into that?
Okay, key change. I mean, for Annex 1, I suppose one of the major changes which relates to ourselves is the differentiation between cleaning and disinfection. So not putting them together, it's actually separating a cleaning process from a disinfection process. So disinfecting visibly and physically clean surfaces.
And you know what question is going to come from that, don't you, Neil? Of course you do, right?
Of course.
Does this mean I have to rinse after every time I apply disinfectant? Right. I mean, again, it's not saying how, it's just saying you have to rinse, right?
I think this covers exactly what, and from the site assessments that Dave was talking about as well, is where we see the implementation of these regulations change and vary so considerably, because people are having to take that little bit of information and put it into practice within their facility. So whereas one end user may say, yeah, I'm going to be rinsing every single time I clean in services before I disinfect. Others may do that on a weekly basis. Some may do it on a monthly basis. It's still not a distinct terminology to say you must do this each and every time.
And I would offer that most will probably do it not frequently enough.
Most will certainly err on the side of less frequently to more frequently, yes. Yeah. But I mean, it really brings down a big point. This has come along because I think for anybody who visits a clean room facility, if you had to say what's the most obvious issue with cleaning and disinfection that you see within an area, one of the top answers will be residue.
Yeah, for sure.
And obviously the regulators over the years have also taken note of this from visits and feedback that they'll have. And so they're trying to actively change the mindset to try and control these residues, whether they be residues from the disinfectant products they're using already or residues from the process or other elements of the manufacturing facility.
Oh, it used to be though, right, Neil? It used to be that a visible residue from disinfectant application was a good thing, right? It was evidence that you were applying sufficient disinfectant.
It may sound counterintuitive, but I've had that told to me directly by at least half a dozen customers when I've been there for visits, where they previously thought that it was almost like a protective layer to show that the disinfectant is actively being used.
Yeah, I mean, in the U.S., and this goes back a ways. I mean, things are changing, but 20 years ago in the U.S., that was the norm, right? That was the expectation, is you would see residues. That was a good thing. And as we're finding,
and of course, where that makes a fundamental change is people could apply disinfectants to that extent and not have to worry about removing them.
Right.
The removal side, although it makes clear sense if you think about the process, you're applying a chemistry to a surface within a clean room environment, you should be removing that chemistry at some point if it leaves a residue. But of course, that takes time, that takes labor, that takes more money. And it's another part of the process. It's not making the money. The end product is making the money. This is just another key element of that process.
Yeah, but I will say again, not to sound like a broken record, but I think Annex 1 will create a whole host of opportunities for providing expert guidance to end users on how to navigate the requirements of Annex 1 and implement it in a way that they can manage to sustain over the long term.
So since this is a podcast and our audience can't actually submit questions to you all, what are some of the common questions that you hear regarding how people can comply with these regulations as it relates to their cleaning and disinfection programs?
Oh boy.
Where do we start?
I think Neil touched on one, and I'm not sure whether we did it justice, and it comes up, one I hear more than anything is, how often should I rotate? my different
You
disinfectants.
took the words out of my mouth, Karen. Exactly. That probably is the most frequently asked question in relation to what we're talking about. How often should I rotate? Should I rotate at all? I mean, I've been to facilities that are using genuinely 6 to 8 different disinfectants within their facility, and then others which are using 2 or 3. Who's right? Who's wrong? Well, I think, this always comes down to, as we go in and talk about it, it comes down to the grade of clean room they're using, the risk to the end product, and also their environmental monitoring results. It all kind of feeds in. If you're using 2 disinfectants and in control of your process, is that worse than using 4 products and not being in control of your process? Certainly not to my mind.
I mean, that I did have that conversation with a senior MHRA inspector, and he said if the facility is in control, if their environmental monitoring is in control, he wouldn't even ask how they were achieving that. He wouldn't ask if they were rotating disinfectants. He's purely looking to see if environmentally, microbially, it's in control.
And that's often what we come across, right? We come across a customer that's doing X, Y, Z, and they're saying, well, it may not be the best practice, but our EM is good, right?
Yeah. Or the regulator was happy last time they come in, and they don't want to uncheck a checkbox. Doing what they've done. Exactly.
But we could get into a whole nother discussion about the validity and believability of EM as well. Right.
It's a snapshot in most cases.
And that's even if it's done properly and correctly, right? Because a lot of EM, good Lord, is maybe not purposefully, but de facto providing false negatives, if you will, right? Where they should be catching stuff.
On that day, even if the information is great, I've been to facilities that are doing it once a month.
Yeah.
But do you base your whole program on one result in a month? You wouldn't do it for anything else.
Yeah. Right.
But again, that's all increasing through certainly the Annex 1 changes.
Yeah.
More continual monitoring expected.
Right. No, I mean, Annex 1 is going to be awesome in terms of tightening up some of the things that had been fairly ambiguous in the past, which I think is great. I had a question posed to me a couple of weeks ago. Someone asked, is Annex 1 going to be the worldwide standard at some point? And I think it probably will be, frankly, because it is such a broad treatment. So many different organizations were involved in its creation, and it fundamentally makes sense, and it's broad enough to be applicable worldwide. So yeah, I think at some point Annex 1 will be the default standard.
I think so, and I think with the ambiguity, and we're talking about relating it back to questions as well. I mean, another one, it's putting more emphasis on the customer themselves to look at their own facility. So previously they would take data from ourselves. So as a supplier, manufacturer, they would take our data, maybe do a little validation. But now they've been asked to look at organisms within their facility, surfaces that are representable of their facility. So it's more pushback on having that data that's very much relatable to their manufacturing facility, rather than, the other big question that I always get asked: how frequent should I disinfect? And the answer is, there is no set answer. It really is facility to facility, process to process.
Often enough to be in control, according to a robust and effective and validated EM program, right? I mean, that's the answer. It's the answer that no one wants to hear.
And that's a common thing that you do see wherever you're talking to people. So we're coming to you, Contec, as the experts in contamination control. Please give me a black and white answer on how often I should clean and disinfect my facility and my different grades of room. And very often are disappointed when we say we can help you, but we cannot tell you what that is, because it's specific to your site, facilities, microbes, etc. That is the question.
I think, Karen, doesn't that answer the question that, it's going back to right at the beginning when we talked about prescriptive wouldn't be good, but the fact that it's not prescriptive does lead to people not knowing some of these answers, which I suppose is maybe a good thing for ourselves. We have the ability then to go in and kind of provide our knowledge and experience and help them very specifically within their facility to achieve those goals. And that's those goals of having a facility that's in control microbially, in control particle-wise as well, and overall relating to that patient safety part that we talked about at the beginning as well.
So I'm curious, did any of what we talked about answer the original question?
Well, sorry, go ahead, Karen.
Oh no, I can think of something else that's going to mean we don't answer that original question. In terms of questions that we get asked a lot, when you specifically start to look at the disinfectants, because of the way, again, that regulations work, Europe and North America, and also the fact that there are no specific clean room regulations within, disinfectant regulations within the clean room industry, that confuses a huge amount of people. So is it a sporicide? Is it a broad spectrum? The EPA, then another regulatory body, come into play in North America. The biocidal products regulation from the European Chemical Agency comes into play in Europe. And again, asking the rest of you, that comes up a lot, doesn't it, in terms of questions?
Very often. I mean, in the States, disinfectants are regulated by the EPA, like you brought up there, the Environmental Protection Agency, but FDA governs the pharmaceutical manufacturers. And an interesting thing to point out is that the EPA defines a sporicidal agent as achieving a 6-log reduction of spores, whereas the FDA defines the sporicidal agents to be used in a clean room facility, let's say, as achieving a 2-log reduction. So what that means then is that a pharmaceutical manufacturer can use a product that is not defined by EPA as a sporicidal agent, achieve sporicidal efficacy if they get a 2-log or above, and the FDA will have no issue with that. But EPA would not define that product as a sporicide.
Yep, and you're left with customers reading labels on disinfectants that are approved and tested according to EPA standards, trying to conform with regulations that are imposed by the FDA. So yeah, it's a conundrum, which is why Annex 1 is going to solve everything.
You're very often then that at least in the US, that pharmaceutical companies go off-label. Yes. Because as Dave just pointed out, the label is governed by the EPA, whereas they're governed by FDA. So they may not use the product as prescribed on the EPA-approved label.
And here's the crazy thing. Well, and this is the crazy thing that's hard to get through to customers because it takes an incredible amount of work, but you could use water if you could validate that it's effective, right? I mean, honestly, as long as you can validate that what you're doing is effective, you could do that. But the work to do that is just tremendous.
Do you think, though, that, so if we're talking about regulations becoming more harmonized, is there ever discussions that go on between EPA and FDA to either make a defined exception for clean rooms? Are those conversations had?
No.
You're shaking your head yes and saying
I mean, I suppose at least in Europe, we do have a set of standards. We do have the European test standards that at least give commonality throughout. So, we have different regulations. Again, a sporicide is a greater than log 3 reduction in Europe. So confusion can also we can have a product that's labeled as a sporicide in Europe that couldn't be labeled as far as the EPA guidance goes with the same criteria in the US.
Right.
In the United States, we have a saying
for harmonized disinfectant testing.
Ooh.
In the United States, we have a saying that it's clear as mud.
Clear as mud.
Kind of what it sounds like here.
Well, no, I mean, Karen brings up a good point, right? There's been talk about harmonized disinfectant, right, regulations, and maybe there's something to be said for that. But God, that's getting even. I
think that'd be another podcast in its own right, just talking about that topic.
Oh no, it totally would.
That is the next one.
We have a couple more resources, though, I want to share real quick before we finish our discussion. Coming up on May 19th, we'll be hosting our first Contec Talks webinar of the year. So Contec's been providing contamination control solutions to various facilities around the world for more than 30 years, as you've heard in this discussion. In this time, we've seen a lot of cleaning and best practice errors. So on May 19th, we'll be hosting a panel discussion on the 7 sins of contamination control in clean room environments. So stay tuned to our social media channels for more information.
That's going to be
And then for our European audience, since we don't have a worldwide regulation yet, for our European audience, Neil and Karen will be participating in Europe's first Contec Talks virtual seminar on contamination control on April 29th. So registration for that's open at www.contectalkseurope.com. Karen, do you want to say anything quickly about that seminar?
Yes, as Daniel mentioned, it's our first European one. This is following off the success of one that we did in North America towards the end of last year. The keynote will be a replay of the recording from Scott Kelly, the NASA astronaut who holds the record for having spent the longest amount of time in space. So we'll start with his recording and some of the questions that he answered when we did the US one. We've also got Tim Eaton joining us from AstraZeneca. He's the sterile manufacturing specialist there, and he will be talking about the control of airborne contamination. Neil's looking at a topic he mentioned earlier, residues from disinfectants, and I will be looking at the detailed changes to Annex 1. So yes, if people are interested, that's the 29th of April.
And so go to contectalkseurope.com to learn more about that. All right, so that's the end of this second commercial break. For the last couple of minutes of our podcast, I'm going to pose a question to you folks. Let's say someone's listening to this, they're an end user at a facility, and they know they have a regulatory challenge or challenge with meeting regulations right now. What do they do?
Wow.
And you only have 7 minutes to answer that question.
Well, right. So I'll jump in. I think the first thing they have to know what the challenge is, right? I mean, they have to know what the problem is. And so I'm assuming that they do, right? Let's assume that they know what the problem is. The real question is, do they have the resources in-house to address the problem, and the experience and knowledge in-house to address the problem, or don't they? If they do, then they're probably in good shape to do so. If they don't, then they pretty quickly need to identify who they need to talk to get down the road to a solution.
I mean, to expand on that, we'll throw an example. They may be finding they have higher microbial counts within their facility than the limits allow. And it's things like what we call contact time in Europe or dwell time in the US. That's something that, again, that's another big topic of discussion at the moment, ensuring disinfectants wet on surfaces for the right amount of time. And I've been in many facilities that have had issues with the environmental monitoring or even with the finished product that really relates to the cleaning and disinfection procedure, not specifying a dwell time or a contact time that relates to their process. In other words, it dries before it's reached the validated contact time. So it's really, as David said, knowing what the problem is and then knowing who they can speak to help them overcome that situation.
Or is it a source problem, right? Are the microbes being brought in on a consistent basis or being transported throughout the facility from place to place on a consistent basis because of someone's behavior or lack of proper gowning or anything of that sort?
And that sort of thing is kind of, again, where we come into play as Contec. So to finish out this podcast, to leave our audience with, Dave, could you just one more time remind people about the assessment program and how they can get in touch with you and your team for that?
Sure. So the contamination control assessments that Contec provides for our customers worldwide can be accessed through the website at contecinc.com. I think we have under resources, there's something regarding the technical services group and the contamination control assessments. That's one way. You can always email us. You can email Neil or myself. My email address is dnobile, Nobile, at contecinc.com, or Neil at nsimpson, SIMPSON, at contecinc.com. And yeah, we'll get direct and immediate response to any questions that people might have.
Thank you to everyone on the panel. Thank you to you who have listened through this whole podcast, and we hope that you'll participate in one of our upcoming events that we've talked about. Contec has numerous resources that are available. We're here to help you. If you have any general questions about these upcoming events that you may have heard, you can email learnmore@contecinc.com. Thanks for listening.